It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Ike Miller, and we're going to be discussing his book, Good Baggage: How Your Difficult Childhood Prepared You for Healthy Relationships. Ike, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Shaun, it's so good to be here. Excited about our conversation today.
Well, my pleasure. Just finished listening to the book yesterday. Loved it. So I'm psyched to have you on the show. I know for a lot of my audience, this is the very first time they are meeting you. So we're going to kick this off by having you share a bit of the Ike Miller origin story, superpowers, special abilities, all the crazy stuff. What do we need to know about you?
Yeah. So I grew up here in North Carolina. I am, my parents are, sharing a little bit of my story that I get into in the book a little bit. My father and my mother were separated for much of my growing up time. My father struggled with alcoholism, which informs a lot of my story, a lot of what I get into in the book. And me kind of writing this book was a lot of me working through realizing the ways that my childhood had impacted me that I thought, I'd gotten over with, I'd dealt with a long time ago, or had not experienced the baggage of my childhood at all. And then getting into challenging relationships and discovering, oh, actually, there's some stuff to work through here. And so that's kind of how I came to this book.
And in terms of writing process, on the one hand, how long did it take? And the other thing too, just the balance of pain and catharsis, because something like this, where on the one hand is we're growing up and we're living life, and we get into adulthood, we just end up in relational situations where this stuff comes out. But when we're trying to formalize it to share it with the world, it's helpful, but it's painful. Like, what did that whole process feel like for you?
Yeah. So the process of even coming to the idea of this book was really my own journey of discovering just how prevalent the impact of my childhood was, meaning it wasn't just affecting my marriage, it was affecting my leadership as a pastor, it was affecting my relationship with my children. And so during the pandemic, kind of the background to the story was we were leading a church plant that was about 18 months old at the time, and so already kind of the stress and anxiety of like, are we going to survive this? And, we've never done online church. We don't know how to do it. We can't have people in our house to do it for us. And so there was kind of that anxiety. And then you build on top of that sort of the racial tension in our country at the time, the political tension in our country, navigating as a pastor. Do we do in-person gatherings? Do we not do in-person? Do we require masks? Do we not require masks? Like all of the things that there were so many opinions about during that season. And for me, I just wanted to make everybody happy. And I wanted to make everybody happy with me. And I believed that if I could sit down and have a conversation with you, that we could get to a place of agreement and we would be okay. And going through that time and having conversations where we couldn't get to agreement, I discovered was just exhausting to me and overwhelming, and revealed to me that there was some stuff going on inside of me that I needed to work through. And so as I began to explore this, I began to understand more of kind of the impact of my childhood on my leadership. And so that's really where some of the writing around this began. I did a couple of articles for Christianity Today, but I also was posting a lot on Instagram and social media, and just sharing, I would start saying, those of us pastors who grew up in dysfunctional families experience this. And as I would share that, people would latch onto that. And it kind of became this thing of like, I think there's a conversation to be had here.
Well, the reality is, for most of us, we had some kind of dysfunction, in the idea of being in a divorced home, a home with addiction, a home where our parents may have never been married. It's so normalized, and in a large degree, even worse for the people who came up after a lot of us did. And so a lot of us carry that stigma all around with us. But as you found out, when we start sharing our stories, it starts empowering other people. Like, oh, that me too. Yeah, me too. I've been there. And so, I think it, on the one hand, when we choose to share, it also helps us to feel like we're not alone. Because I feel like when we're dealing with this stuff, we feel weird. We're like, man, I'm the only one. All these other pastors and leaders, they got it figured out because they had perfect childhoods. But we pull back the curtain and we're like, wow, actually, a lot of us had similar experiences. So we're all kind of messed up in the kingdom together.
You know, I made the transition at some point during this from the assumption that I was the only one, everybody else has got it together and is fine too. We've all got stuff, and it's more the exception if you don't have stuff. And so I'm just going to work from the place of you've got stuff too. So me sharing this is not necessarily me being the only one, but saying, hey, this is a safe place for you to talk about this. Let's just be real.
Well, and if you tell me you don't have stuff, I assume you're probably lying and you're
Yeah.
just not to a place where you're ready to share because you may not think I'm a safe person or this isn't a safe group. And so,
Yep.
I feel like not if you dig deep enough, but if you wait long enough,
Yes.
something will come out. We've all got
Something.
our things.
Yes.
Talk to us. I love that the title is kind of upside down in the sense or backwards. That talk to us about this idea like baggage is good, or like I might say, wow, your baggage. There's bad stuff, but it's kind of a superpower at the same time. Like that's really what I saw this book in Barnes and Noble, and I was like, this is a compelling title. And again, as a publishing guy, I think about those things, and
Sure.
that's what got me to pick up the book.
Awesome. Yeah. So, as I was thinking through how I wanted to frame the book and thinking about how many of us, when we think about our difficult childhoods, dysfunctional family, maybe a parent with a substance use disorder of some sort, we think about all the ways that that is going to make our relationships bad, all the ways it's going to make us bad at relationships. And so when we think of baggage, we typically think of all the things that make us bad at relationships. And, I kind of start out the book sharing that I had this idea of, man, I just hope I marry somebody who doesn't have any baggage. As if like I didn't have any baggage and I didn't want to marry anybody that didn't. And then kind of finding out, no, I do have baggage. I've got plenty for the both of us. But as I was digging into that and beginning to discover working through the impacts of my childhood, I also began to discover ways that my childhood actually put things in me that I could use for the good of my relationships if I could learn how to use them. And so being able to say, okay, not everything that got put in that baggage is bad. And so how do we kind of rifle through the baggage to find the good things or the things that we can leverage for the good of the relationships now? So kind of playing on that emotional tension there a little bit.
Well, and I love that you used an example of Bill Clinton, former president, in the book. You don't get a lot of Bill Clinton examples in Christian books, but I think it's one worth sharing in the sense that
Yeah.
he had some rough things in his childhood and his upbringing. And I'll let you comment on this in a moment, but I've read a lot of books from well-known influential authors talking about meeting Bill Clinton, watching him work the room, that he really has this superhero level ability to read everybody and make everybody feel like they're known and well, like they feel like he's their best friend. And that's everybody that he encounters in the room. And that stems from his childhood. So unpack that a little bit for us, because he made in that one instance a superpower out of something that was really a survival mechanism or a way to just get through the day, probably when he was a kid.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, including Bill Clinton in this story in there, you're kind of walking a line where I always have to be clear, like, this isn't because I like admire him or because I, detest him. It's just he
Picture on the wall in your office, emulate all the things.
I wasn't going to mention it, but no, so I actually read his book or read his story in a book called Overcoming the Dark Side or Overcoming Darkness, kind of, and this started out this chapter, and I included it because there's so much in his story that made sense or communicated the point that I wanted to communicate, which is Bill Clinton grew up in an environment where he had a mother and then a stepfather, and the stepfather was an alcoholic. And one of the stories that is shared from his childhood is that this father or this stepfather could be violent, could be abusive at times. And one of the stories that sticks out is his grandmother was dying, and so his mom wanted to take him to the hospital to see his grandmother, and his stepfather forbid it, would not allow it. And she was like, I'm taking him anyway. And his stepfather hauled off and shot over her head, but shot a gun in the house just over her head. And so it kind of gives you the sense for like the chaos of the environment he grew up in. And what's interesting is, but then you hear him talk about his childhood, and he's like, "Yeah, I had a pretty normal childhood." And you're like, "What?" But I mean, I felt the same way. I was like, yes, my father had an alcohol use disorder, and there were some things that, but I had a pretty normal childhood. And I think it's part of it's because we just don't know what normal is. And so we're just kind of like, I came out okay, but hearing that, but then kind of seeing the ways that that manifests in him. One of the things that happens for those of us who grew up in this kind of dysfunctional context is we walk into every room reading body language, reading emotions, and we're trying to determine, like, with this person, am I safe? Is it safe to be here? Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they angry? Do I need to find a way out of here? And so then as an adult, you keep doing that. You go into every room trying to determine, A, am I safe to be here? And B, if I'm not sure, how do I communicate and interact with you in a way that makes me safe here? In other words, makes you like me in a way that I'm safe. And so the ways that that's kind of used for our good is it can be a powerful tool of empathy. I can read your emotions. I can tell what you're feeling. I can engage you on an empathetic level. But the way that it tends to work against us is we read people's emotions and then believe that we can read your mind as a result of it. And so we're constantly trying to read each other's mind or other people's minds. And that gets us into this place of assuming we're responsible for how somebody else feels when it may have nothing to do with us. But really, where it got into trouble for Bill Clinton was in his kind of political pursuits. He found himself in this kind of context where, with one group, he would kind of color his answers in one way in order to kind of gain their approval, get them on his side. But then a different group of people, maybe a different wing of the party or whatever it is, he would color his answers in a different way that ultimately, for those two people getting together, might have thought, okay, that's not what he told me. And it comes off as deception or dishonesty or lying. And quite honestly, that was powerful because during the pandemic, I found myself doing a similar thing where I would talk to some people in my church, and I would, if it was around race, for example, and I would kind of color things in a way that I thought would be acceptable to them. But when I got with a different group of people in my church, I would color things a little bit differently because I thought maybe it would make them happy with me. But I realized if these two people get together and talk, they're going to be like, he lied to me. And so it can lead us to be deceptive as well if we're not careful.
Next, I'd love to have you talk to us about what it was like as you learn to become more self-aware. And honestly, the best way to do that is get married, because our wives will tell us all, like, one of the funniest but most helpful experiences early, and this is in my early 20s, when we'd go to a party, a church event, whatever. I was just not very outgoing and afraid of everybody at that stage of my life. And my wife was like, "Do you realize when you're standing in the corner at a party or whatever, the expression on your face says, 'Do not talk to me. I'm going to murder everybody in this room,'" kind of a, and I had no, like, she's like, "Your body language is all closed. You look really scary." And I had no clue, and so that's, that, maybe not, maybe that's from my upbringing, maybe not, but just our wives are always ready to help us find ways to improve because they love us and they want us to be better.
Yeah.
Or sometimes they want to start an argument, but we'll assume most of the time it's for good. But I feel like when we're starting out, or especially in our 20s, we're more trigger response. And then as we get older, we get more mature. We get counseling and the other things that come along with dealing with some issues. We can actually pause and maybe come up with a better response. So I'd love to just hear, like, what was it like for you to just learn to mature where it wasn't always trigger response. It's like trigger, okay, let's make some decisions, maybe a
Yeah.
better response.
Yeah, it is such a long journey, and a part of that is, I think, as once you hit your 20s, you have to experience certain patterns in your actions, your response, your behavior that lead to negative outcomes before you can really get honest with yourself that maybe there's something I need to deal with, right? Because as long as you feel like everything is up and to the right, life is good, I'm not experiencing any relational pain, at least not that I'm aware of, then we can kind of float on thinking I'm doing this right. And I think when we begin to experience consistent pain in our relationships, we can either push in the direction of externalizing, kind of assuming everybody else is responsible for my relational pain, and therefore they're the ones that need to get fixed and do their work. Or we can go in the direction of internalizing and thinking I'm the cause and the problem in every relationship that I'm in. And the key is trying to more discern where am I responsible and where are others responsible. But in order to develop a certain degree of self awareness, we have to internalize a little bit. We have to at least be willing to say, there's something I'm responsible for here, even if I'm not responsible for the whole thing. And so, what I encourage people as they're trying to develop some self awareness is just to begin with your pain points. Because, in terms of our internal world and our emotions, those can be harder to get access to, get in touch with. But it's not hard for us to identify when something is painful or when something is negative or negative feelings that we are experiencing. So I always encourage people to start with, where are you experiencing relational pain right now? And then begin to go down layers asking, okay, where am I responsible? How am I creating more conflict and more chaos in my relationships? And as you do that work, you realize how much of it is triggers to things, that if you can disarm the trigger, you can actually respond in a much healthier way in the relationship. And in the book, I go into some ways of doing that. But I think it just begins with that willingness to acknowledge, okay, I play a part in my relationships too. And so how do I, whether I am the whole problem or just part of it, begin to work towards a better relationship?
Next, I'd love to have you speak of the power of having a good counselor in
Yes.
your life. And I think of when I talk to younger married couples, people who are just starting out, like my wife and I have been married for 26 and a half years at this point. I'm like, oh, you're at year 5. I'm like, get ready to get a counselor in year 7, because that's when you have to deal with, like, okay, this is the list of things that probably aren't going to change and I don't like, and this is the list of things that have been consistent and I'm not sure. And so
Yeah.
year 7 marriage counseling is a real thing, folks, if you've never thought of that. So,
Yeah.
I always kind of chuckle through the years. I've seen hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of book proposals, and I love marriage books or parenting books that are pitched from somebody, either, they've been married 2 years, or all their children are under 5. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't need advice in
No.
either of those circumstances. But so kind of two things: power of having a good counselor, whether it's individually or for your family or for your marriage, and also kind of that balance of what's an issue for your pastor and what's an issue, like, really that's more appropriate. Like, your pastor is going to hopefully steer you in the right direction, but
Right.
we'll often want to go to our pastor before we'll go to a counselor.
Yeah, absolutely. So in speaking of good baggage, one of the things that I discovered early on, even before I got to any of this, was I was able to look at my parents' marriage and see, obviously it's not what I wanted for my own relationships, but I could also see some of the things that kept them from getting the help that they needed. So for example, with my father, there was a certain level of pride that going and getting help meant I have to admit I have a problem. And so pride kind of got in the way of doing that work. But then there was also the piece of, when you don't have a counselor, you kind of have to ask the question, okay, when is this bad enough that we need to go see a counselor? Like, at what point do we bring them in? And at that point, a lot of times it's the counselor is sort of a last ditch effort or a matter of formula on the way out the door. And so early in our marriage, I said, I never want to have to ask the question, when do we bring a counselor in? And B, I would rather us deal with problems while they're small rather than waiting until they're big. And so we actually started seeing a marriage counselor in our first year of marriage, and we've met with her monthly since the beginning. So this almost 15 years now. And I could not recommend that highly enough, because it meant dealing with things before they became major problems in our marriage. For the guys out there, the way that I typically try to encourage them to think about this is, it's kind of like maintenance on your car, right? You don't wait till your car is dead on the side of the road before you take it in to get the oil changed. Like, you get the oil changed every 3,000 miles so that it doesn't die on the side of the road. And so I encourage husbands not to take better care of their cars than they do their marriage. But so encouraging people to jump in, be proactive about their relationships. And the good baggage of difficult childhoods is, I can either do this work and prevent that, or I can avoid this work and find myself in a similar place potentially. So there's that. In terms of pastor versus counselor, I think if we're talking, you have known trauma in your life, abuse of some sort, then I think that is certain. Definitely go straight to a counselor for. I think that the complexities of trauma, the complexities of abuse, they are honestly they're counterintuitive. They just don't make sense to us if we haven't done the study to understand how trauma affects us. So I would say that's something where you go straight to a therapist or a counselor. I think in general, I think it's a good place to start with a pastor and to come in saying, "Hey, I am open to counseling. I'm open to a therapist, but I would like to have your wisdom on, is there a counselor that you would recommend? Or maybe let's begin with some foundational things that come from my faith, and then we can move past that to counseling." For the pastors out there, typically what I'll do is I will say I'll do 5 sessions for us. And then at the end of that, I'll either be able to determine, I think we've reached the point of this is as far as I can take you. I think it's good for you to seek out a counselor, or I think we could benefit from a few more conversations. But setting it up from the beginning of the goal here is to determine whether you need to see a counselor beyond what I can do, and for me to be honest about my limitations. And so I think kind of starting with the pastor, but communicating up front, my goal is to work with a counselor if that's what we feel like is needed.
Yeah, one of the parts of the book that made me chuckle is you share a story where you had a couple that was working with you, and you became like the rally point for the couple together, where they were just both fighting with you, but that actually brought them closer together. It seemed like for the
Yeah.
first like
Yep.
what a weird dynamic to have happen
So
in the midst of
strange.
that kind of a
Yes.
situation.
Well, and discovering they were bonding over their conflict with me, and you're like, I don't want to be this guy. I don't want to be in this position.
So yes, if you want to hear more of that story, listen to the audiobook, read the book. It was a yes, it was like, oh yes, the wonders of loving people. So you get to learn so many things. I think for this latter part of the interview, I'd love to have you kind of contrast bad side of baggage, good side of baggage. And the thing I kept thinking about over and over as I was listening to the audiobook, most of the time, this baggage, good or bad, it manifests in the midst of relationships as we're dealing with other people, being in relationship with people. That's where we get triggered. That's where we have to make decisions about how we're going to respond, how we're going to treat people, all the things. So we'll start with the less scary ones, and we'll kind of move into the more personal ones as we go along. So bad side of baggage, good side of baggage. Friendships, relationships. What were some of the challenges? And as you've grown and shifted, like what are the good things on this side of the journey, if you will?
Yeah. So, growing up in the context that I did, I internalized a lot of the impact of my childhood. And I mentioned internalizing versus externalizing. In dysfunctional families, different children play different roles. And some of that depends on whether they internalize or externalize. Externalizers are the children who tend to not take responsibility for anything. And they kind of are like, I've tried to be good. I've tried to do things right. It didn't make a difference. So I'm just going to do whatever I want to do because I'm not ultimately at the end of the day responsible. Internalizers take it all on themselves and just believe I'm responsible for all of my parents' problems and all of the dysfunction. And so, being more of an internalizer, what I discovered in my relationships is anytime, even if they didn't tell me something was wrong, anytime I could discern that something was wrong with a friend or a coworker or anybody I was in a relationship with, I just automatically assumed I was the problem. I was the cause of their negative feelings. And so then I would jump into how do I fix this? And so a great example of this for me as a pastor was I was a young adults pastor, and one of the things that would happen is on Sunday mornings, I would have parents of my young adults come in the front door of the church, and I would look at them as they're coming in. And if they had a negative look on their face or maybe a frown or like they looked upset, I just automatically assumed like that was a reflection on my performance as the young adults pastor. They were disappointed in how poor of a job I was doing serving their kids, right? And so I would jump into, oh no, what have I done wrong? I got to make this better. And in reality, may have had nothing to do with me. In fact, it probably had nothing to do with me. My counselor at one point, we were talking about this and I told her the story, and she just stopped me and she said, I just want you to know, Ike, you're just not that important. And you're like, well, that's humbling, but I appreciate it. And so that creates problems because you take on others' emotions as a problem that you need to fix. And that begins to impede in your relationships because now they can't just come to you to express, here's what I'm going through without you jumping into fix it mode. And we all know when we have a friend who always jumps to fix it mode, how frustrating that is, right? Because you're like, this isn't a safe place. Like you come across as having all the solutions, all the answers, and it ends up not being a safe place for me to just come and share what's going on. And so being able to back away from that of assuming I'm responsible for every problem, but staying at the level of reading people's emotions, I mentioned earlier, actually allows you to be an incredibly empathetic presence in their life. You know, they can come into a room and they don't even have to say anything. You can tell on their face that something's on their mind, and you can say, "Hey, before we get into whatever we're going to talk about, how are you doing today? It seems like there's something weighing on you." And the ability of that to just open up a conversation and communicate, this is a safe place, is a powerful, powerful gift to your friends. And so that's one of the ways that that operates both against us, but also can operate for us if we can learn how.
Well, and I've seen through the years, whether it's some of my children who are adults now, as they're learning to navigate the world, if you're trying to figure out how to manage the world, so to speak, like everybody who walks through a door, clearly they're all thinking about me. They don't like all the things. Just the stress of trying to manage everybody's everything is overwhelming. You can't do it, and I love that your counselors told you like you're not that important, and because
Yeah.
I feel like especially when we're younger, we just think everybody their world must revolve around us. And the reality is most of the time, like the rest of us, they're just trying to get through the day, live their life, do the things. And so they might think about us every once in a while, but probably not as often as we think they do.
That's right.
Next, let's transition into, and I feel like this is one that comes up, as we're growing up and into early adulthood kind of, and I'm kind of bucketing these all together, like mentors, leaders, coaches, bosses, especially I feel like for a lot of us who have father woundedness, we have these kind of often male authority figures over us, and it can be kind of wonky trying to figure out how to, in a
Yeah.
healthy way, relate to these people and function with these people.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, one of the things that was interesting early in my and Sharon's marriage, I was a student in seminary, and I remember telling Sharon one day that I had this, question thing that I wanted to talk to the professor about, and she was like, "Well, just go talk to him." And I was like, "Just go talk to him?" Like, it did not make sense in my mind. Like what made sense in my mind is if I'm going to go talk to my professor, I better have a good reason for it because I'm wasting their time otherwise. And Sharon, my wife, was like, "That's what they're there for. They're professors. They're supposed to be there to answer your questions, to help you." And so discovering that I had this fear, this intense fear of wasting their time or coming off as stupid or dumb, because I didn't ask a good question or uh, any of those kinds of things. And so my fear and my desire to please these professors was working against me because I felt so unworthy of their time and their attention. What I discovered in that as well is that I had this desire to always put myself in the best light for mentors and for teachers. I always wanted to come across as I've got it together. The problem with that is, if you've ever mentored somebody, if they always come to you as if they've got it all together, they don't have any questions, there's nothing they're struggling with, you're like, "Well, what am I doing in your life? Like, why am I even here? Why am I mentoring you?" But also, a good mentor knows when you're putting up a facade, right? They can see that you're being fake. And so I had to come to a point where I could accept with these mentors, with these authority figures in my life, if they're going to mentor me, if I'm going to be really developed as a human, as a pastor, as a leader, then I have to be willing to be transparent and acknowledge, here's where I'm struggling. Here's an area of challenge for me. And so being able to begin in that place of here's the ways that I'm struggling, but also knowing, I want to be a different father than my father was. I want to be a good pastor. That's going to require me to grow and do that work of humbly accepting and submitting to leadership in ways that maybe my father wasn't. That gave me this intense motivation to take their leadership and to implement it into my life. And so I think it can bring us to a place of great humility that will say, "Yes, teach me," but we have to be willing to break through the facade of how do I just please you in the first place.
Well, and I found in my own experience during my undergrad days, fortunately, most of my professors were pastors or
Yeah.
had like actively or had been like
Ah,
for a good chunk of their career. And so it was interesting, definitely a different kind of like mentoring and coaching from them than say just the average academic. That was actually a real blessing to me early on in my life
mm, that's
journey.
powerful.
Now we'll get to the one where like where the rubber meets the road, I
Yeah.
feel like we start to become aware with some of these things as we're coming up, but it's really when we not so much when we have the girlfriend, but like the girlfriend who becomes the fiance who becomes the spouse. Like I feel like God, God bless the father for giving us good women in our lives to help us see those things. But I feel like that's where all of a sudden you have this person who helps you become hyper aware of like, oh wow, like I have way more issues than I ever thought. I know for me, I was just like, I didn't realize I had all this stuff. Thanks for letting me know. So kind of good baggage, good bad.
Yeah.
What does that look like in that really one of the most important relationships in our lives?
Yeah, just to share my story with that, my first diagnosis of depression was in 2009, just a few months after Sharon and I got married, which you think that should be the happiest time in your life. Why did you experience depression then? And the story is, we had made a trip to go to Disney World, and so we were there, and here we were in what is supposed to be quote the happiest place on earth, and I'm just not very happy, and in fact, I'm quite melancholy. I'm having trouble enjoying myself, and so we come back from this trip, and I'm like, gosh, I wonder if something's there. I wonder if there's something to dig into, and meeting with the counselor and walking through that, I think what I discovered was not so much that being married made me depressed. Like, that's not what we're talking about. What happened for me was, I think before being married, I would have seasons of melancholy, seasons where I was down, but I could generally just kind of go off to myself and deal with that. Maybe I was a little less involved with friends. I wasn't going out, hanging out as much. But in general, people were at a distance far enough that it didn't really affect them if I wasn't feeling okay. But once you're married and this person is in your life every day and their emotional world is very much hinged to yours, then my depression or melancholy or whatever is going to affect them. And so now I couldn't just kind of go off by myself and deal with it and kind of come back when I felt better. It was affecting my marriage. And so it wasn't even like Sharon kind of pointing these things out to me as much as it was when we are in intimate relationship with one another, there are things in how we function and operate that affect one another in a way that other relationships just aren't affected by. And so I think for me, that was kind of what brought it to the surface. I think then when the longer that you are together in relationship and you become more comfortable with one another, your lives are more intertwined. And so the things that are important to me, if they're not important to you or they are important to you, we have strong feelings about it. And so we leads to arguments. And that's where I think the impacts of our childhoods really begin to surface. Is not when things are happy and smooth, but when there's disagreement. How do we engage in disagreement? How do I respond when you bring an accusation against me or a frustration with me? Am I defensive? Am I open to that? Those are the times when we begin to become aware of the ways that our childhoods impacted us and the ways that our family of origin shaped how we enter into those kinds of conversations. So I think that's a bit of how those things begin to come to surface in those relationships.
And I very much saw myself in one of the stories you share in the book where you talked about your wife would tend to come at you strong and kind of unload on you. You would be quiet and retreat. She would go off into one corner, you in the other, and she'd be reloading one like. And
Yep.
that's exactly how it was for me and my wife as well. Where she's like, we're gonna talk this out and we're gonna solve it now. And I'm like, yeah, you're attacking me. I will go hide. Like I don't
Yes.
know how to deal with that. And like it's in those first few years as you're learning how to communicate in hard situations like that's where how each of you saw your parents deal with conflict, like it comes out. And the other place I think too where, and this is probably one of the strangest, like it's like a deja vu moment, like with our kids. And as especially if our kids make us angry or there's a lot of stress and tension, we'll a lot of times our initial responses, we're like, man, I could have done that better, or I got angry and I yelled, and then, but after a while, you're like, oh my gosh, I've become my father. Oh my gosh, I've become
Yes.
my mother. Like at first we don't realize it, but after a while, I feel like we do become self conscious of it. We're like, I'm actually playing out the exact same things my parents did when they raised us. So just talk to us about that kind of good baggage, bad baggage when we're
Yeah.
just being a dad out there doing what we do. What do we
Yeah.
do when some kind of the the negative aspects of our upbringing all of a sudden show up when we're trying to be a good dad? We didn't even intend it.
Yeah. You know, with both our marriages and our parenting, the good baggage to kind of bring us full circle on that is because of what we saw in our parents' marriage, we knew what unhealthy was. We knew that what they did was unhealthy, that it wasn't the best way to do relationship, but we didn't know what healthy was. And so some of the good baggage for our marriages is instead of pursuing kind of normal or pursuing kind of what we saw because it seemed to work for our parents, we have to pursue being a healthy relationship very intentionally. And so some things that go into that are things like um, choosing to fight for one another instead of against one another. Meaning, I think we grew up in contexts where we saw our parents kind of fighting to win and fighting to who's going to win this argument. And at the end of the day, we see when you fight to win, everybody loses. But when you are working together towards a solution, that's when it's a transformational conversation. And so, in those kind of conversations, like the one you mentioned, where she goes off to reload, I'm quiet in the corner, is how do we move that from an argument over who's going to win to how do we move this in a more productive direction? Because at the end of the day, I don't want to experience divorce like my parents did. And so even if I win this argument, it's only going to take our relationship closer to that. So let's move this more towards solution. How do we do that? That I think carries over then into our parenting because as parents in those moments where we find ourselves reenacting the same things that our parents did, it's incredibly painful because it's dawning on us for the first time. There's things in me that I didn't even know were there, but because it's all I saw, it's all I know how to do. That's just default what I default to. And so, as parents, being able to both recognize the moments when we are reenacting the things that we saw our parents do, but also recognizing that's not going to change just because I saw myself do it. In fact, it's going to be a journey to move from reenacting what our parents did to a new process. And so, that process, in short, basically looks like this. We first recognize that we are doing things that our parents did after we've done it, right? We did it. We look back and we say, oh man, I did the same thing that my parents did. The next step is you will begin to be aware in the moment. I am doing now the very thing my parents did that I don't want to be doing, but I don't know what else to do. And so you're kind of having this like dual experience where you're aware of yourself doing this thing that you don't want to do. And so at that point, beginning to formulate a plan of, well, if this isn't what I want to do, what is it that I want to do? How would I like this to go in the future? And so then we'll move into a period where we're going to actually watch ourselves do the thing that we don't want to do as we are changing our behavior. And ultimately, over time, we will begin to develop the ability to stop ourselves before we enact what our parents enacted. The challenge with that is we have to begin becoming aware of what it feels like before we respond the way that we did as our parents did. So, for example, for me, one of the things that I found myself doing was using the tone of my voice, the level of my voice to intimidate my kids into doing what I wanted them to do. Because that's what I saw my dad do. That's how, at the end of the day, if he wanted us to do what he wanted to do, he could intimidate us into it by the tone of his voice. And so I would find myself doing that. And then as I kind of lived in that place of frustration of I'm doing the thing I don't want to do, I began to pay attention to, well, what does it feel like as it's leading up to this? Well, I can feel my body getting tighter. I can feel myself getting frustrated. I can feel myself wanting to explode on them. And so what that means is not exploding, but stopping. I just need to stop. Even if they continue to argue with each other for a few minutes, I just need to stop and think intentionally, what do I actually want to do in this versus just enacting what my body wants to do in this moment. And so the good baggage in all of that is recognizing I don't have to do this the same way my parents did. There can be a better way. And in fact, me having greater sort of awareness of my emotional world can actually help my kids develop a greater awareness of their emotional world. And kind of putting that on display for them so that they can develop that for themselves is just a really powerful thing.
Well, and I feel like with the kids and the parenting, it's an ongoing journey as they age. Like right now, I have kids ranging from 4 to 25, and
Okay.
as they get older, and not even so much that they're gonna. Sometimes, if they're in a bad place, they might kind of throw something in your face back at you. But I find my older kids, my teenagers and adult kids, they will give me a constructive criticism or a feedback about how I'm responding to something, and that's really hard to take because it's like
Yeah.
like you should respect like that. I feel like it triggers you in a different way than like your kids when they're little. They often won't push back on you as much, and so that's just been an area I've had to really grow into because like how I was raised, like you just didn't talk back because it wasn't allowed, and I see it as a good thing that my kids feel like it's a safe enough situation where they can deliver something hard to me and I should be able to receive it and process it and let's figure out how to get to a good place again. But
Yeah.
that's just something to be aware of. Like it's one thing when the kids are little, but as they grow up, I feel like the older kids are just going to bring out different things that we just need to work through. So if you only have little kids, just be aware as you get older, you're going to learn new strengths and you're going to learn how to shift and change it. But again, like my wife's and my want always was, can we create a better environment than we grew up in? Like, can we create a more stable family situation for our kids so they can stand on our shoulders in a way maybe we couldn't from our family of origin? And again, that is an example. The fact that my kids feel comfortable sharing hard feedback with me says, okay, you have some different footing than I did because I wouldn't have even dared to tread there.
Mm. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but
And some of that too is just, I think the tension that we all feel as parents is we want to be firm, we want to be consistent, we want to, we don't want our kids to be the kids that are just kind of acting out or just out of control or whatever. And so the inclination of the temptation in that moment can be kind of to revert to maybe what we saw with a harsh parent or a harsh disciplinarian, and realizing that's not necessarily going to lead to the long-term outcome that we want of a relationship. It may get what we want in the moment, but in the long term, is it going to damage the relationship? And I think as parents, especially if we're in public, it can be so hard to know, like, how do I navigate this in a way? And I don't want to create a scene, but I also want to, put on display like good parenting. And as a pastor, man, as a pastor and a parent in Target, like those are some of my most humbling moments where you're like, man, if there's anybody from our church here, man, I hope that I'm handling this well.
yeah, the moral of the story, shop at the Target 50 miles away from
That's
where you
right.
know. That's probably not a good,
Yes.
well, and again, that's an example of we are worrying about what other people think of us.
Yes.
And we're so yeah, and by and large, it's probably almost all strangers. Who cares what these strange like at the end of the day, like their opinion has zero bearing. But we're always like one of my coworkers, somebody from my church, we just get worked up. But I mean, that's just life with kids, man. They just
Right.
you
Yep.
never know what's gonna happen, when you go out with a bunch of toddlers and,
Yes.
5 and 6-year-olds. So,
Yep.
always an adventure. In terms of reader takeaway, reader's journey with the book, they go all the way through, like, if they grasp one thing, like, what's that? You're like, "Hey, if you read this book, this is the thing you need to see. This is how I want you to be shifted, changed on the other side of this journey."
Yeah, the thing that I try to tell a lot of people is, I'll have people come up to me after like a service or after I've spoken somewhere and share that they had a similar story or a dysfunctional family. And they're like, I just don't want my childhood to, I don't want my children to experience the thing that I did. I don't want my marriage to be like my parents' marriage. And I think there's so much fear that because of what they experienced, they're just going to replicate that in their own lives. And what I try to encourage people to do is to recognize that the fact that you are aware of that, the fact that you want it to go differently is a huge first step. I mean, that's kind of the first thing I talk about when we turn to the good baggage in the book is the fact that you have this drive in you to do your relationships differently than what you saw and what you experienced. And so just what I would say to anyone that's listening is just to say, if you experienced dysfunction as a child, if your parents were, dysfunctional, or there was any substance use in your family of origin, pain, abuse, to know, first of all, that does not predestine you to bad relationships yourself. But second of all, to let that experience drive you to do your relationships differently, to not let pride get in the way of you seeking out help and wisdom, to not let your fears of what people will think of you to go and do the work that you need to do, but let that motivate you to have your relationships go differently. And then the book is really about here's my advice, my counsel for how to go and pursue that.
And for the listeners, the viewers who want to connect with you, find out more, all the things, where do we discover you on the web?
Yeah, so my website is ikemiller.com. There's lots of content there. I'd love to connect with people there. There's a little chat button. You can hit that, and I'd love to connect with you there. But also social media at Ike Miller.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to Ike's website, social media, as well as links to places where you can pick up your very own copy of his new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Ike Miller. Once again, our book today was Good Baggage, How Your Difficult Childhood Prepared You for Healthy Relationships. And Ike, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Shaun, for having me. It's been great.